Welcome to Hogwarts, and by extension, welcome to the broader wizarding world in general. Today's lecture, we are going to be talking about setting and its role of importance in the fantasy genre, and what specifically it has to offer the Harry Potter universe, and what Rowling does with that concept. We can probably skip the theme music today and just go straight to... Let's start by talking about setting in general. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you learn pretty early on in your history of literary analysis. This is something that's often taught in like third grade. Focus your attention onto what the setting is doing, how it's working, all that kind of stuff. For our purposes, I think the first thing to note is that setting plays a different role within a narrative depending on what genre we're in. Some genres just could not care less about setting. It's just sort of plot, action, character. Where they are is nothing more than a backdrop. Other genres put the utmost importance onto setting, most notably the speculative genres, science fiction and fantasy, where setting becomes a major component of the experience, something that sort of a selling point, I guess would be the easiest way to describe it, for the narrative itself. Fantasy, of course, this is really true of. We have a lot of fantasy works and series where like the main character can die. We can throw things 1,000 years in the future if we need to. What matters, what people desire, is the setting itself. I want to go back there. Now, Harry Potter is obviously in the fantasy genre. We'll talk a lot about genre in a later class, much more specifically. But I think if there is a broad genre that Harry Potter fits into, it's pretty clearly fantasy. So that's where Harry's coming from. And then beyond that, just in terms of establishing the generalized stakes here, how important is Hogwarts to the Harry Potter experience, or how important is like the broader wizarding world to the Harry Potter experience? They literally made a theme park, several now, where you can go just like walk through that setting. You can spend a hilarious amount of money to walk through that setting. So obviously this is a major point of appeal. So for these reasons, for the fact that it's so important to the fundamental genre of fantasy, and because before we get into a specific text, I really wanted to focus on some of the world building, we're doing fantasy setting as our first lecture in the study of Harry Potter. Okay, so let's start by throwing a little bit of setting theory at you. Now, as I mentioned, setting is important to fantasy, so much so that people have argued that the defining aspect of fantasy, the different subgenres available to fantasy authors, is entirely a product of the relationship between the setting and the story itself. Most notably, Farah Mendlesohn is considered probably the greatest living academic on the subject of fantasy. Wrote a fairly recent book called Rhetorics of Fantasy, in which she articulates how the fantasy genre as a whole is way too big to constitute a genre, an opinion that I agree with, and that we in fact have to subdivide it into 4 genres based upon the nature of the relationship between, again, the story and the setting. I won't walk you through all of that. It's kind of complicated, but it's really a good read. If you're interested in fantasy, this is something you should check out. It's a popular book too. You can find it in bookstores, and there's no bookstores right now, we're in COVID. You can find it on Amazon and help support poor Jeff Bezos. So the ones that we are interested in is Portal Fantasy and Intrusion Fantasy, 2 of the 4 that Mendlesohn articulates. Now, Portal Fantasy is kind of right there on the label, I guess we'd say. It is fantasy in which there is a portal to another world, and the story becomes about the relationship between those 2 worlds, most notably through a protagonist who permeates that portal, who goes to both worlds. According to Mendlesohn, Portal Fantasy usually works through elaborate description. In this sense, it's very much like travel literature, a kind of dead literary genre that used to be wildly popular, but then we got photographs and suddenly travel literature became less important. So the same idea here applies, where what you're having is like a tour guide take you through this world that in this case doesn't actually exist. And a huge part of the appeal is, ooh, look at that, what's around the next corner, that kind of thing. And we can see a lot of that, particularly in the first Harry Potter movie, but certainly a continued thread throughout later texts. According to Mendlesohn, in keeping with what I just said, Portal Fantasy works through continual new imaginings. It just keeps showing you cool stuff That's it. Think of it as like a toddler, if you have like a niece or a nephew who you haven't seen for a few days and just wants to show you everything in their room. That's Portal fantasy. You're living a Portal fantasy in that scenario. And according to Mendelsohn, it also focuses on the concept of restoration, which is the idea of the portal to this magical world, but the magical world needs help, or your world needs help, and the magical world can help with that. So you have to restore one or both of the worlds in question. So there's a lot of like repair work being done. That's usually how the plot forms, around fixing something that broke the thing. And then the other aspect of fantasy described in Rhetorics of Fantasy is what's called intrusion fantasy, which is fantasy of a hidden world within our world. So it's kind of like Portal, but not with the literal portal. The idea being that there's an entire society or civilization living unseen within our reality, and we're getting to know them and their connection to our world. So as you can see, both of these forms of fantasy operate in Harry Potter. We do have a clearly defined portal in Platform 9 3/4, but we also have this intrusion fantasy that you can really see Rowling playing with in her opening chapter, which is all about the Dursleys encountering weird folk on the streets, congratulating them, and all that kind of thing. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Let's talk about the concept of mimesis, a much older concept in fantasy literature. Mimesis refers to the art of imitation, that is, of creating something that isn't real in imitation of something that is. If you want like a really easy shorthand for that, think fiction. In fact, that's very much how Plato described it. He thought of mimesis as imitating reality, and he hated that. He was like, why would I create a fictional world when I can go appreciate mine? Go sniff a real flower instead of some magical one you're describing. However, our society has moved beyond those ideas a little bit, and we start to look at imaginative works as impressive feats of the human mind. So, the fundamental division in terms of mimesis in a fantasy world is high mimetic versus low mimetic. High mimetic fantasy, often referred to as just high fantasy, refers to immersion in a supernatural world, which is to say you're creating a world whole cloth. Think Lord of the Rings. So this is Middle-earth. We're in Middle-earth. Here's Middle-earth. Here's a bunch of Middle-earth things. Now, low mimetic fantasy is different. It's defined as a supernatural intrusion upon our world. So this is a scenario where you have a normal reality and then something supernatural comes into it. Think like every horror film ever made, except maybe the slasher ones. But even then, kind of supernatural. Where you're in your normal reality, but there's a dude who can murder you in your dreams. There's your supernatural intrusion. Anything along those lines would kind of make the cut. High mimetic fantasy typically requires expansive detail and is therefore usually a genre reserved for phone book-sized books aimed at teens or adults. Not kids' books, typically. We don't have a lot of high fantasy for children, with a few notable exceptions. And even then, they have to do a lot of shorthand stuff. Low mimetic fantasy tends to be more common for kids, and extremely common for kids. In this sense, it kind of reflects the attention span of its audience, travel literature not being super duper popular with children. So high fantasy showing you around this incredible supernatural world that they've created is only going to work for so long. There's only going to be so much wow the kids can give you. And as a result of that, as I said, it's a little bit rare to see high fantasy written for young adults or children at this point in time. Rowling's world is pretty dense, however. So the question that we're going to have to deal with at some point is, how does she do that without bogging us down in detail? How do you show us this brand new high mimetic world that is the wizarding world without, I don't know, becoming J.R.R. Tolkien, where he's describing a tree for like 4 pages and you're like, I get it, tree. We could probably move on. So engaging with that concept of the attention span, creating a world that is novel and magical and real and beautiful, without having that much time to build it, requires a skillful set of tactics and tools. The most obvious one that Rowling uses is borrowed mythology. A lot of the myths in the Harry Potter universe are myths that you've seen in other universes. You've probably been exposed to them in public school. So when she says there's a dragon, you're like, okay, I know what a dragon is. When she introduces something a little bit more abstract, like a Grimm, and you have to go to Google and look up what a Grimm is, and you should absolutely do that. That's a really cool story. Then we can do that as well. So my basic point here is just that What Rowling was doing wasn't easy, and building the kind of world that she's building is something that is maybe counterintuitive to the genre that she's working in, which is to say young adult fantasy. And that's something we'll be attuned to, especially when we start talking about the first book in our next lecture. Okay, so that's mimesis, another core component of fantasy. Next up, mythopoesis. This is described as the creation of a fantastic world. It is a topic that defines the fantasy genre quite naturally and is often used like in reviews of fantasy texts, evaluating the quality of the author's mythopoesis. So as said here, it's the creation of a fictional mythology, which sounds simple, but it's far more complicated when you know anything about how myth works. It's extremely complicated and forms over hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. Think of it as like a stone that's being shaped by many tides and river currents and all that kind of stuff. Can you tell I'm not a geologist? So there's different theories of where it comes from. We don't want to get too deep into these. There's the allegory theory, which is that myth is directly symbolic of real world events. So it's a way of describing history, essentially. There's the euhemerism theory, which is that myth is a distorted account of historic events, which is very related. And then there's the myth ritual theory, which is the idea that myth fills in gaps in terms of what we do. So sort of explaining things that we don't have an answer for, like that science can't provide. Again, you don't really need to know this. I just want you to have a sense of the complexity of what myth is. The purpose of myth in most mythologists' eyes is primarily to establish models of human behavior. Some theorists suggest that myth is therefore a natural reflection of culture. That if you want to understand what it was like to be a Viking, read some cool Viking stories, even though they're like supernatural and weird and completely fictional. It will, to some degree, reflect what's important to that culture, their values and ideals. So again, myth shifts. It's malleable, it's flexible, and especially so when it starts to pass through different cultures. So you have like the Cinderella myth that goes through literally thousands of iterations in different cultures, gets adapted and readapted and remade and fixed up. And you can even look at like a recent Disney live action Cinderella movie. What has it done to update that myth? And how do the choices they made in order to update it reflect the culture where we are right now? And that kind of thing. So mythopoesis then is illusion, essentially. It's the idea of taking this complex process, this years and years spanning evolution, and making it look like it did that, but like on the spot. So create a fully fleshed out mythology from scratch that feels like it's been through that evolution. That's not easy to do. And as I said, in fantasy circles, it's considered a real marker of quality. Okay, next up, imaginative satisfaction, which relates to what we were just talking about. Specifically, this is wish fulfillment. Fantasy components are believed to express things that we lack, as I just said. But here it's not just ideals and values, it's again needs, things that we're not getting in our natural reality. In this sense, myth or fantasy can actually serve an important social purpose, allowing us to continue with our lives instead of being destroyed from that which we lack, if that makes sense. So a great example is the Chronicles of Narnia. You think about Narnia as a classic fantasy setting, one that inspired Rowling very directly. You can look at what was happening as that book was being written, and obviously as that book was being read, and how Narnia satisfies something that the people living in that time were not getting. So most notably, the Chronicles of Narnia takes place in a safe environment during World War II. You have all these children who feel absolutely powerless, suddenly dropped into a world where they're competent and powerful and destined to succeed, and they have a kick-ass lion bodyguard who won't let anything happen to them even after he dies. He's also Jesus. So it gives them things that they don't have in World War II. As a result of that, it becomes really, really popular, which you maybe could have seen coming. At the same time, they again get things like power, control, and they're special in a way that they weren't at that time. Santa is in that story and gives them weapons. We don't need to talk about that. So the same logic applies to Harry Potter. Again, coming back to our first question in the previous lecture. Why did this work? What were we missing in the 1990s that Harry Potter gave us? And I mean, extending that, of course, again, through this malleable process of myth movement. What are we missing now that accounts for the enduring popularity of Harry Potter? What does he give us that we can't get from our lives? That's the question. And it'll come up in our discussion questions. Okay, balance. So, one of the key sort of structural challenges amongst fantasy writers is, again, this idea of like novelty, creating this beautiful, fantastic world that you'd want to tour through without making you feel estranged from it, without making you feel overwhelmed and confused. So the challenge then is to create awesome new things that aren't so unfamiliar to you that they lose the reader entirely. There's different ways that Rowling works to keep her world relatable to us. For one thing, her heroes are from our world, at least for the most part. So this could be us. Again, every child, come on, is waiting for their letter from Hogwarts, because they too can imagine going through this exact scenario. And the experience that Harry has in terms of getting to Hogwarts is an entirely identifiable one. You live in a suburb and you wait for something exciting to happen. And for Harry, it does. And for you, it doesn't. Except when you read Harry Potter, and that brings us back to imaginative satisfaction. I'll try not to torment you with what you're lacking, though. Let's be cooler than that. Also, making things relatable. The dominant religion is still very much in place in the Harry Potter universe. There's Christian structures all over the place. So the world isn't upended entirely as you might think it would be if there were witches and wizards running around. And in fact, we'll talk later in the course about how Christianity was a little bit nonplussed with the popularity of Harry Potter as a pagan text, as it was called. It's not true at all. It's a very Christian text. In fact, Harry kind of becomes a Christ figure by the end of it. And then we have medieval history, which is very familiar. A lot of this new stuff is taken from like old tales of knights and dragons and castles. So we've seen a lot of this stuff. So she can show us this cool stuff that's maybe not as new as it appears to be on the surface. We get that experience of novelty with a corresponding sense of familiarity that keeps us grounded. So that's, again, another kind of burden on the writer when she's constructing this high fantasy universe, making sure that she's not overwhelming the reader and thus, I would say, alienating the reader. And Rowling's really good at that. We'll talk about that next class. Okay, so let's talk about some of the key elements of conventional young adult fantasy as a genre in itself. I don't think any of this is going to be too world-shattering for you, but it's good to go through them just to kind of remind you that they exist and are out there in the Harry Potter universe. The first is good versus evil. This is a binary. It's simplistic as a representation of morality, but I think that's kind of the appeal. The idea that there is a good side and there is an evil side, and the evil side will conveniently wear dark robes and sometimes not have noses. In order to let you know quite clearly that they're on the evil side. And they'll like murder people and stuff like that. And the good side will be like nice, friendly people who get along well and have each other's back. That kind of thing. Sometimes they bake cakes. So that one's not remotely shocking. Anthropomorphism. This is the idea of taking traditionally lifeless things and giving life to them. Specifically human-like life to them. So for example, trees are cool. I used to climb trees. Wouldn't it be cool if that tree had a personality and was a bit of a dick? That's anthropomorphism. Let's just take a whomping willow, we'll give it a ton of personality, we'll give it attitude, and it'll be exciting to us on some level. But this applies to other things as well, of course, most notably animals being anthropomorphized in exciting and interesting ways, sometimes leading to moral questions that Rowling absolutely does not want you to ask. The hidden world behind a platform. This is, again, coming back to Mendelssohn's theory of intrusion fantasy and portal fantasy, for that matter, as well. This mixture of fantastic with the ordinary. We're also going to have a world of prophecy, where the future is foretold, and therefore the world has meaning and structure in a way that ours probably doesn't. The stakes will always be world-altering, as you would suspect. There's very few fantasy stories where you just kind of hang out for a little while. Maybe dig a ditch, give them better irrigation systems, and then go back to your world. It's always, again, coming back to that restoration element. Ultimate threat trying to destroy the very fabric of the universe, and only this child hero can save us. And you're like, should a child be doing that? And don't ask that question. Nostalgia. YA fantasy tends to be medievalist. A lot of people discuss this, and we'll get to talk about it at some point in our class as well. It's kind of weird that there's this one specific era of human existence that we really like to go back to in fantasy, specifically the Dark Ages, which is Why, I guess, would be the fun question to ask. Let's not ask that one yet. As said, a lot of YA fantasy is medievalist in nature. It doesn't have to be. It can be any era, any culture. It just likes this one. Myths brought to life. So you get to see the mythology that you've read about in textbooks actually interacting with you. Centaurs sounded really cool in Greek mythology. Oh shit, you've got one in your forest? I would love to meet that thing. And away you go. The Messiah Complex. The Messiah Complex is this, it's not actually a real complex, by the way, it's just a cultural term. The Messiah Complex is the idea that you have a character who is completely not special, sort of like you and me, just ordinary folk living their lives. That sucks. I wish I was more important. And some dude shows up and says, take the blue pill, or come help me rescue Princess Leia. And oh, it turns out you're not unimportant. You're actually the most important being in this entire universe. You're fancy. You're special. That's the Messiah Complex. YA fantasy loves it. Think of all your YA protagonists and the number of them that are like secretly important to the world, but no one knows it at first. It's kind of like a human fantasy of, I wish I was more special. No one notices me, but they're all wrong. I'm awesome. And then empowered children, which is really hard to do credibly, and Harry Potter honestly struggles with this sometimes. So empowered children is again like the Narnia thing, where you give a 12-year-old a sword and say, go slay the queen, and he's like, okay, cool. Where in reality, that story doesn't end well. You can't teach a child to swing a sword that quickly, and they would be absolutely slaughtered. Shouldn't be leading armies at all. It's a terrible idea. Harry's in the same boat. He should not be facing Voldemort the way that he is. He is constantly put in situations of child neglect. But we gloss that over because, of course, kids want to read about kids who aren't sheltered to the extent that kids kind of need to be sheltered because they're tiny and fragile and sometimes kind of stupid. So that's one of the core fantasy elements in YA fantasy. As I said, it requires a lot of suspension of disbelief, but it may be necessary. Okay, so Rowling's world. Rowling has cited C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia as an inspiration for Harry Potter, especially the idea of a portal into another world. So again, we've got some direct transference to some of the examples that I've been using so far today. She identifies the distinction between these worlds as Lewis's separate worlds versus Harry Potter's world hidden within our world as this sort of important point of distinction. So Narnia, it actually kind of does have that. It just doesn't spend much time there. Whereas Harry Potter's world, there's a definite correspondence between the world of humans, I should probably call them muggles, and the wizarding world at large. They interact more. And frankly, more and more so as the texts go on. But we'll get to talk about that as we move into later texts. It's an important element of like raising the tension. What do you think? What's the difference? That sounds like a discussion question. Note as well that conflicts between the worlds provide much comic relief, especially in the second book with the introduction of Arthur. But it also ups the stakes later on. Eventually, it's not just, like Hogwarts, this fictional castle that's in danger. It's your world as well. So she does really cool things to kind of integrate reality into the fantasy in order to, again, as I said, create more tension. Escalating tension. I feel like I've covered my last point there. Okay, so let's isolate Hogwarts as the most famous setting piece in the entire Harry Potter universe. There's a lot happening there that we could kind of point out. It is a castle. You probably noticed that. So we're definitely dealing with medievalist fantasy pretty clearly. It's also weirdly very university-ish with the robes and all that kind of stuff. But university doesn't look like that for you right now. It looks like sweatpants in your parents' basement. So we can maybe let that slide. It's a boarding school, thus connecting to the school days genre, something we'll talk about more when we do genre. It's a really important, incredibly British genre about going off to boarding school. They, for the longest time, like a century, could not read enough stories about British people going to boarding schools. As you might expect, it wasn't super popular here, but it was gangbusters in the UK. Hogwarts is Hogwarts is also the center of the wizarding world, arguably the real Ministry of Magic, frankly, since everything important happens at Hogwarts, including very important political debates and decisions where you're like, shouldn't that be happening somewhere else? No. And we'll talk about aggrandizing Hogwarts in approximately 30 seconds. It's also really importantly, in terms of its effect on character, a place of transformation. So the most literal transformation is you're going to go from being a boring person to a cool wizard. And we don't have to do much with that. That's pretty basic. But more interestingly, it coincides with this other transformation of child to adult. So maturation in Harry Potter, again, an iconic element of the so-called school days genre, is completely commingled with becoming a wizard. So becoming a wizard is becoming an adult in some really kind of cool ways. And we'll get to track that extensively throughout the course. I just wanted to call attention to Hogwarts' role in defining both of these transitions. Harry's fundamental metamorphosis is entirely dependent upon the space that he occupies. That's just the setting becoming really important in the Harry Potter world, and may help to account for some of the love for Hogwarts. Okay, so as mentioned, aggrandizing Hogwarts. Everything of importance happens here, as I mentioned, again, to weird and improbable levels. There's going to be a really cool major wizard tournament. Where's it happening this year? Oh, I bet it's Hogwarts. And yes, it's Hogwarts. The final battle, man, is at Hogwarts. That's impressive. Things that make Hogwarts more important, maybe more naturally, is the presence of Dumbledore, who is the most powerful wizard in the world. He's the only thing Voldemort fears, other than Harry. And he is the center of all manner of like political debate and all that kind of stuff. So it's a convenient excuse for people to like show up because they want to talk to Dumbledore. And Dumbledore doesn't feel like coming to you. You come to Dumbledore. He's that important. Additionally, Harry is the center of power in the wizarding community, the future of the wizarding community. He goes there and is somewhat more vulnerable there, which might be a plot hole that they try to, sort of plug in the last book. He should be vulnerable elsewhere, but no, let's go get him at Hogwarts. That's the best plan. Let's try that. It's also the center of the wizarding world that our hero is exposed to. So when Harry Potter learns about the wizarding world, it's primarily through his interactions at Hogwarts. It's only progressively later that he branches out further and further and further. So it's a good way for Rowling to control how much of the setting she gives you right off the bat, again allowing her to keep things grounded and familiar. Let's start with Hogwarts. And after that, we can start to move on to broader things like a Ministry of Magic and other schools internationally, and then just everything by the time we get into the later texts. Finally, Hogwarts simulates childhood very effectively since, school, I shouldn't have said was here, given our current lockdown, was the center of your world when you were Harry's age. And I think that's true of most everybody. If you were homeschooled, I envy you a lot. But that was where everything happened. That was where you spent your hours, where you spent your days, where all the most dramatic and monumental things occurred. So having a character's life be defined by this setting, and obviously it is a school, really, really works in terms of simulating the sense of importance of the school to your childhood. So there's lots of ways that making Hogwarts so central to the wizarding world actually does kind of make sense, or at least ways that Rowling portrays it in such a way to naturalize how important Hogwarts is. And as I said, it's the final battle. Why is the final battle at a school? That's silly. And Dumbledore? Spoiler, no, Dumbledore by the end. I'm sorry if I ruined Harry Potter for you just now. I'm assuming everyone's read it, but I can be that jerk. Okay, so this leads us to our discussion questions. Here's what I have for you today. What attributes are most pivotal to the wizarding world? What makes this setting so appealing to a generation of readers? So when you define the wizarding world in terms of like its characteristics, if someone says, oh, I've heard of this wizarding world, could you describe what it is? What makes it special? That situation is happening right now because I'm asking you to do that. Additionally, what elements of the wizarding world transcend Hogwarts? Let's try to branch out a little bit on our own rather than, me lecturing at you. Think about what we see in the broader wizarding world, including things like the Fantastic Beasts universe, where Harry Potter's not even born yet. And McGonagall shouldn't be born yet, but she is. As like simple examples that sort of showcase how what the wizarding world is can move beyond Hogwarts, and by extension move beyond Harry Potter even. Again, it has a characteristic that seems to transcend these things. Additionally, what aspects of our contemporary reality / existence, up to and including COVID isolation, so like now, does Harry Potter provide imaginative satisfaction for? coming back to one of those early questions. What is it that we lack in such a way that makes visiting the wizarding world so absolutely appealing to us? How does Harry Potter satisfy the gaps in our mediocre existences? I'm sorry, I was going to try to end on a positive note. Say something positive in the comments. That'd be good. You can do my job for me. And that is your second lecture on setting. I hope you loved it.